Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. This is Achieving Access to Food on a Healthy Planet, a session of Consumers International's Sustainable Lifestyles Summit. We're marking World Consumer Rights Day on the theme of a just transition to sustainable lifestyles and organising a week of online events across a range of issues. We have a few on food. I think some of you just moving over from our previous session on food loss and waste. It's one tomorrow on sustainable diets, enabling availability, accessibility, affordability. And today we're really delighted to be working in partnership with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, a really close partner of Consumers International, to focus on this topic of achieving access to food on a healthy planet, looking at the ways we can align action between delivering sustainable food systems, but also ensuring access to food and nutrition for everybody. And this really gets to the heart of this theme of a just transition to sustainable lifestyles. This is building on, many of you may be familiar, last year's UN Environment Assembly, a resolution was passed on promoting sustainable lifestyles, encouraging governments to integrate this into their environmental action. It's been a long-time priority for Consumers International, working with governments in the environmental space, but in the food system space as well, to make sure that we are integrating action on diets, on food consumption, on access to food into these strategies for a true food systems approach right throughout the value chain. So really honoured to be having this session. We have a really great lineup of panelists joining us from all over the world and from all kinds of sectors and different types of organisation. So set for a really good discussion. I can see we're still letting people trickling into the call, but I can maybe start to share some of the details on housekeeping, logistics for the session. Next slide, please. We do have interpretation available into French and Spanish for this call in particular. With thanks very much to our interpreters who joined for this. To access interpretation, and we just lost the slides. We could bring that back up in a moment, but there were some instructions, and I imagine many of you are familiar. Just go down to this More button at the bottom and select interpretation. There's also transcription available. Again, an option to show captions at the bottom of the screen, so we can see and cover more languages that way. If there's anything else that would be helpful to address. Just trying to think of what else was on those slides. A particular one is for interaction. You'll notice that the chat is not operational on this Zoom link, but we're using the platform Slido to collect comments, questions from the audience today. All of the outcomes from this discussion, as well as submitted by the audience on some of these key solutions needed, will all factor into our post-summit publications and supporting some of our advocacy towards the UN Food Systems Summit, towards COP30, towards the UN Environment Assembly. So please do share some ideas there. I think we have in fact, I can put that in the chat now, a link to access that app. Please do share any comments, any questions. We'd love to hear them. Otherwise, I think we are good to get started. I'll quickly introduce all of our speakers today before passing over to our opening speaker. In a moment, we're going to be joined by panelists from a range of organizations. From the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, we're joined by Juan Echanove, Right to Food Lead. From the World Bank, we're joined by Geeta Sethi, Global Lead for Food Systems. From the Consumer Grassroots Association, Consumers International member in Kenya, we're joined by Alice Kamunto, Executive Director. From the Gates Foundation, Shelley Sundberg, Deputy Director for Adaptive and Equitable Food Systems. And from the Institute for Applied Economic Research in the government of Brazil, Ricardo Campante Valle, also representing the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. But to set the scene for us before that panel discussion, really pleased to welcome Dr. Stefanos Fotiou, Director of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Stefanos, could you please kind of share a perspective on how efforts to combat hunger and malnutrition can be aligned with action for environmental sustainability, and how can, in particular, the UN Food Systems stocktake in July and the National Transformation Pathways reflect this goal? And a reminder to Stefanos and to other panelists to keep to time. We only have an hour, so I'll have to be strict. Stefanos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and good day to everybody. I'm really pleased to join this event, which is part of the Sustainable Lifestyle Summit. It brings me many years back when I was in UNEP, and I was running a unit that it was called Cities and Lifestyles. It's really long time ago that we have started talking about the effect of lifestyles on our environment, our society, the way that we are running our planet. When I got the invitation for this event, and thank you very much for inviting me, I asked my colleagues to put some talking points for me together. And, you know, I received paragraphs and paragraphs of extremely unpleasant numbers. Global hunger at about 757 million people in 2023. About 2.8 billion people, more than 1/3, it's 35% of the global population, unable to afford a healthy diet. Hidden cost of food, about $12 trillion, as FAO has said last year with the SOFA report. Even if we intensify our efforts, by the end of the decade, we'll have around 600 million people still food insecure. About 33% of the people being on a moderate food insecurity. So there's not a single number that it shows a glimpse of hope when it comes to the way that we are running today our food systems and the way that our food systems are impacting our environment, our lives, our planet. I forgot another number. 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are driven by food systems. Yeah, it's not food and agriculture, but they are driven by food systems. And 80% of biodiversity loss and 70% of freshwater use also driven by food systems action. And I think that what we need to do is to make sure that we have food systems that are working in peace with nature, and they are also following a human rights approach, which is essential for food security. I'm not going to talk about the human rights approach. I know my colleague Juan will talk a lot about the right to food, but I want to highlight some measures that I think we need, and especially under this idea of consumers, for bold action. And I really tried to be a little bit politically correct with my messages here, but sometimes I need to say some things with their real facts. And I was inspired really by a report that FAO has done 2 years ago. It was an outlook on the food and agriculture, and it mentioned there in the prologue of the report that we need to tackle vested interests, among other things, to make our food systems more sustainable. So I want to highlight 6 things that for me are very important to align food systems, consumer behavior, and the protection of the planet, and of course the society. One, I think we need a kind of consumer rebellion. I'm a little bit, sometimes I don't like the word consumer because consumption has a negative connotation to my vocabulary. Because one of the big problems is that there was an equation between consumption and development, and this is not correct. So consumers are not just buyers. They should be seen as co-creators of food systems. So we need to see from a buyer model, which prioritizes what I will call passive purchasing, to something that I will call the food citizen model, where individuals have agency in shaping what gets produced, how it is distributed, and what values drive the food economy. And for this, we need to push for food literacy in school curricula and digital education, so every child grows up knowing how to decipher what I will call the corporate food marketing, detect greenwashing, and make independent choices that align with the planetary and healthy and personal health. The second is to disrupt the direct to consumer, disrupt the corporate control, and to strengthen direct trade between farmers and consumer via digital platforms. Maybe governments could fund and promote blockchain-based food traceability platforms. So bring closer the producer and the consumer. Number 3, and I say this as an environmental economist, tax the problem, fund the solution. So we need to enforce progressive taxation on food that it has been proven it's negative and deteriorating for the health of the people and the environment. So we need to introduce this true cost food pricing system, and FAO has done a lot of work on this, where food labels reflect the actual cost of the food and not only the price we pay. Then I think we need to, as number 4, to reclaim the narrative from the big food. We need to challenge the marketing power of ultra-processed food by demanding changes that restrict advertising, target, and especially advertising that is targeted at children and vulnerable population. I know there are many countries like Mexico that will try to do this, but they face a huge fight from the big food. And we need maybe a global consumer-led blacklist of misleading brands. Point number 5, decentralized food power. I think we need to focus on urban and community-led food systems, support the creation of urban agricultural incentives, including tax breaks for urban agriculture and for community food systems. Number 6, and for me the most important, financial and policy disruptions. We need national food financial sovereignty strategies and food sufficiency strategies. We need countries to develop acts that prioritize local diverse food systems over a control that it's not actually helping the country, over a control that creates value for people and interest outside of the country. So instead of subsidizing, for example, monocultural crops that they go to specific interest and are controlled by some giants, we need public funds to go directly to smallholder farmers, regenerative agriculture, and cooperative food networks. So that's something I would like to share with you, and I do hope that this discussion could continue in the UN Food System Summit +4 that we will do in Addis Ababa on 27 to 29 of July this year, where we want to bring not only the voices of the governments, but the voices of stakeholders, the voices of non-state actors, and we want to have an environment there that we can openly, transparently, and on the basis of evidence, talk about a better way to organize our food systems. So thank you very much and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stefanos, and absolutely agreed on the importance of rethinking what is the role of the consumer, not just kind of passive purchasers, but really crucial actors in helping to reshape the food system. Really appreciate your comments and looking forward to bringing this discussion to Addis Ababa. We're going to move now straight to our panelists, so we have as much time as possible to hear the discussion. To get us started, as called for, a consumer voice. Alice from Consumer Grassroots Association. From a consumer perspective, how is the challenge of ensuring access to adequate food linked to advancing sustainable lifestyles? And again, please do try to keep to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Charlie, for this opportunity. It would allow me to switch off the camera, if that's okay with you. All right. You asked, first of all, my name is Alice Kimto from Consumer Grassroots Association. And in a CGA, we believe in consumer rights advocacy that is evidence-informed, and we champion for sustainable food systems through agroecology, and we believe in leaving no one behind in food systems transformation. And we believe also that once we work with malnutrition and hunger, once governments and other stakeholders are able to tackle the issues of hunger and malnutrition, then we are in the right trajectory towards sustainable lifestyles. And this is what we believe in as an organization. So going straight to your question that you asked, how is it linked? We believe that and I believe that sustainable consumption needs to be encouraged, but sustainable consumption also comes with the choices that consumers make. Consumers make choices depending on what they are going through. Consumers make choices on food that's available in the market, but there are factors that make them or fuel the choices that they make, and one that's the availability of the food, is there equitable distribution of this food for other consumers, those groups that are underprivileged? Is there a way that these consumers are able to afford foods in the market that are nutritious, and not only nutritious, but foods that are produced in a manner that is in peace, as the speaker earlier said, with the environment and also with the human beings that are living and other organisms. So the choices that consumers make are contributing, and we should not forget that they are contributing to the state that we are in now. And the voice of the consumer is often not taken very seriously. And we believe that if consumers can be brought on board so that they take active participation in decision-making food system transformation, we believe that this will stop, avert, and reverse what is happening currently, and will achieve sustainable lifestyles as we go by. Through this, we are suggesting that agroecology needs to be encouraged. Agroecology and other food value chains that are friendly, environmentally friendly, food value chains that are using less HHPs, that the highly hazardous pesticides that are harmful to the environment, food value chains that consider or are considering the lives over profits. And this is what that can help to ensure that we achieve sustainable lifestyles, and not forgetting that consumers are the ones that utilize the commodities, utilize the foods that is produced. Therefore, wastage that is being experienced, that is amounting to almost 40%, is contributing highly to greenhouse gas emissions, that is contributing also to the state, the climate change state that we are in right now. So fair food production, fair food consumption, and fair food prices need to be encouraged among the consumers. And finally, what we are looking forward to and what we want to encourage consumers to do is that as we go forward, we want to move slowly, because we are being seen as if we are too diplomatic. We want to move away from just doing advocacy to going to demand, be activists, demand for food systems that are friendly to us, friendly to other organisms, and friendly to the environment. And this is where we are headed to. We cannot divorce our consumption patterns with what is happening in the environment. We can't divorce that. It's intertwined. There's no way we can divorce that. So responsible and consumption should be encouraged to ensure that we achieve sustainable lifestyles. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks so much, Alice. Really important, I think, to highlight the connection between some of these challenges, how often it's so intersecting, climate crisis, environmental crisis, exacerbating these challenges that consumers face, but also vice versa. Moving next to Shelley from the Gates Foundation. Could you help us understand how can efforts to promote access to healthy diets also help to be part of the solution to decrease the environmental footprint of the food system and or to improve resilience to environmental shocks? Over to you, Shelley.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So roughly, according to our friends at FAO, a third of food that's produced is lost or wasted. And in low and middle income countries, much of this loss takes place earlier in the value chain before the food reaches consumers. That is during storage, transport, and at wholesale and retail markets. So addressing food loss and waste is a key approach to making our food system and consequently our diets more sustainable with lower environmental impact. And there are specific actions to reduce food loss and waste that also have nutritional benefits. And I will give just one example of a program that we support that's focused on improving food safety. Perishable foods such as fruits, vegetables, dairy, fish, etc., are often the most contaminated with bacterial or viral pathogens. And if food is unsafe, it is not healthy food and it should be thrown out, thus contributing to food loss. It's estimated by WHO that the burden of foodborne disease, which comes from pathogens like E. coli, salmonella, etc., is on the order of magnitude of any one of the top 3 global infectious diseases, which are HIV, TB, and malaria. So foodborne disease is a significant issue that's under-recognized for its impact both on human health and economies. African governments are paying more attention to food safety, and just last week, the African Union established the Africa Food Safety Agency, the first ever such agency focused on food safety at the continental level. And it's good to see this relatively new prioritization of this issue. And a few countries in Africa have also developed their first ever national food safety plans. So we're starting to see movement on this issue. Action to address food safety. What do you do to address food safety? Some steps that can be taken are setting up surveillance systems to catch where the contamination is occurring, investing in storage and retail infrastructure like cold storage, having clean water at retail and wholesale markets, and training food processors and vendors on safe storage and handling practices. There are many more. I was just giving a few examples. So one specific program that we've supported with the UK government, FCDO, was a dairy program in Kenya, which worked with small dairy vendors. They were small business owners, the majority of whom were women, on safe storage and handling practices for milk, as well as training on business practices. There was an impact evaluation, a trial, and the results were that the trained vendors had increased sales of milk and increased consumption of milk among the children of their customers. The training in the food safety and business practices led the low-income, these were urban consumers, low-income urban consumers, having greater trust in these vendors and buying more milk from them for their families. And now the government of Kenya is scaling up this program in several regions of the country. So we have some promising evidence from this program and others that can work both to decrease the environmental footprint of the food system while ensuring increased access and consumption of healthy diets among low-income consumers specifically. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Shelley. And yeah, really encouraging to hear how just as the challenges are interconnected, so can be the solutions. I think picking up on a similar topic, coming from the perspective of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, really leading the work to tackle hunger and poverty. But Ricardo, we know environmental crisis is a major driver of this challenge. To what extent do policy responses emerging need to integrate this issue of sustainability when tackling hunger and malnutrition? Over to you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Charlie, for the question. Good afternoon, good morning for the people that are still in the morning like me. So the short answer is to every extent, we have to consider sustainability. So if we want to increase food availability, we cannot catch all the fishes in the sea. We cannot get all the water from a lake to irrigate our crops. And this sounds so obvious, but humanity hasn't learned that yet. And we are in a very timely moment to have this discussion because we are already experiencing the effects of global warming, of the climate change. And this is more worrisome because the poorest people are the most affected. We have the temperature increasing rates in the tropics being 2 to 3 times higher in the tropics than in any other region of the world. And we have 40% of the people in the world live in the tropics, but 85% of the extremely poor. So this totally disproportionately affects the poorest. And this is not just about global warming, but about the increasing of extreme weather events. So we have a lot of droughts and floods that are already affecting us, like the flood in Pakistan in 2022 that affected 1/3 of the country. We had the flood in Brazil the last year that affected millions of people and displaced millions of people in the south of Brazil. We have 3 years of drought in the Horn of Africa now. And the World Bank estimates that 1 in 5 people will be affected by the extreme weather events until 2030. So if it sounds so obvious, why don't we learn that? And so speaking with my economics background, one reason that I can point out among many is that we have externalities. So back in the simple fisher example, one person can think that if I can't control the others, I will catch as many fishes as I can. I will get my maximum. But this is clearly a problem of the absence of collective coordination. So more than ever, and despite what leaders of the world today and the US think, we have to globally coordinate ourselves. We need international cooperation more than ever to address the problems that we have. And of course, every time consider sustainability when we want to think about policy to eradicate hunger and malnutrition.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more later in the discussion about some of those practical policies, what that looks like in action. So Geeta, we just heard from Ricardo about building environmental issues into action on hunger and poverty. How can this work the other way around? Can environmental policies and strategies do more to integrate considerations on access to food? Do you see this happening already, or do you think a bit more of a push is needed for governments to make progress here? Over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Really a pleasure to be here and with my very esteemed panelists and audience. On your question, absolutely. First, let me start by saying absolutely environmental policies do affect access to food. And yes, we can do things, we can do better things, but I think it comes to something very fundamental, which is addressing food systems transformation in its entirety is really a country, a nationwide policy framework that needs to be in place. It means all of us, whether we are consumers, public sector, private sector, that needs to play a role and have changed behaviors. We've all seen work and reports that when farmers change or move towards more environmental, sustainable outputs, there is a J curve. That transition does mean reduction in their incomes because it takes time for new systems to kick in or new forms of climate smart or sustainable farming to sort of take on. And there are many parts of this equation that need handling. Access to finance, for example. We do know that large number of smallholders and other farmers have difficulty in accessing finance, and that's somewhere very important as well for both public sector and private sector to play a role. Second is extension services. They need to look very different than they do now. The capacity support to farmers need to be and we do have technology that will help tremendously in this process through mobiles and etc. But most important is the social protection or income support programs that farmers do need explicit access to, but also for these programs to become a lot more environmental friendly, so to speak, or nutrition sensitive, however one wants to say this. Today, the global social protection programs are about $1 trillion globally. And when this J curve is happening, when new systems are being put in place, these social protection programs need to be much more explicitly and consciously targeted to the most affected. So I think there is a huge room here for a lot of policy frameworks within a nation, but outside agriculture and food that can help in terms of outcomes of following much more sustainable environmental policies and access. But also, let's not take private sector off the hook on this. The latest Benchmarking Alliance report that looked at the top 350 companies in food and feed, the numbers there are also quite sobering, continue to be sobering, let me say. First is in terms of paying living income, living wages. We know these are the companies that should provide private finance. We know these are the companies that are procuring. These are the companies that have the new technical solutions or climate smart solutions. But the big disconnect between living income, living wages is still remains very, very high. The climate disclosures that these companies are following still are very sobering. This just gives you a quick sort of quick glance into what we are seeing, the role of the private sector as well, in terms of helping move towards environmental friendly agriculture and food policy framework. And
Thanks
these
so much,
companies,
Geeta.
most important,
Geeta,
are not prioritizing health. So let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Geeta. Looking forward to hearing more on that later on. It's a really valuable point. And I know a big question to fit into 3 minutes. But just to round up the first part of our panel, over to Juan, Right to Food Lead at FAO, to help us think through again a lot of these questions. We're thinking about big picture policy integration, coherence across some really complex challenges. How can the Right to Food framework help us to respond in a coordinated way to these challenges of access to food and of building sustainable food systems? Over to you, Juan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, Charlie. I do believe that Right to Food provides a great framework for action. And maybe let me start by saying that the right to food is not some obscure concept. It's a very real, a very concrete thing. It's a legal right. It's protected under international law because it's recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's binding because it's included in binding treaties like the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So what that means that governments must take action. They can't just rely on goodwill or on market solutions. In addition, it evokes principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, dignity. Dignity is a key word that should be in the forefront of any conversation on food systems, right? So it's about empowerment. It's about rule of law. This principle should basically guide actions to ensure the realization of the right to food. So what does all these things mean in practice? Well, I could say that first, that the right to food is not only the right to be free from hunger, but also the right to permanently access adequate food. And that's the other key word that I really want Charlie to highlight here. And adequate food means that that it's produced in a sustainable manner, like my colleagues mentioned, that is nutritious, that is diverse, that is culturally accepted, culturally appropriate, as well as that is safe, right? So food for being adequate, it must be available, it must be nutritious, it must be safe, it must be culturally appropriate, it must be sustainable. So I said it's a very concrete concept. And governments have clear obligations. They must respect people's ability to feed themselves, for example, through right to food laws, right? Many countries are integrating the right to food into their constitutions, into their policies, into their programs. Also protecting them from harmful corporate practices, for example, through food labeling, as Stefanos mentioned before, or corporate regulation, because we have to recognize that much of the impacts on the right to food are coming from large corporates and from corporate concentration. Also, governments have to fulfill their right to food by providing or by facilitating through policies that ensure access, for instance, or via social protection or via better wages, as already mentioned. So the big message here is adequate. Healthy food is not a privilege, it's a right. And that means that governments are accountable, should be accountable for making sure that everyone has access to this adequate food and with dignity. And we should all play a part in ensuring that to happen. Consumers, corporations, and the governments themselves, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Juan. Thanks to all our panelists for our opening intervention, a really helpful reflection on, as we know, such a complex issue. I really appreciate as well all of the comments we have coming through via the Slido from the audience, feeding in on some of these solutions that we need. To run through just a few, we see mention of agroecology, as mentioned by Alice, of course, as a powerful way of building these connections between farmers and consumers, solidarity between stakeholder groups, another point mentioned here, thinking about how do we build those bridges to connect. As Stefanos mentioned earlier, consumers not just in isolation at the end of the value chain, but real citizens, real actors driving this change. Affordability, obviously a theme right throughout the week, not just an issue for nutrition, but for sustainability as well. For anything to be possible, people have to have capacity to buy enough food to eat before they can consider anything else. Supporting farmer innovation, supporting capacity of the private sector, to innovate and to drive these changes that we needed, the solutions suggested. And I think obviously bearing in mind the need for each stakeholder to take on responsibilities as well. It's not just a question for government, although that's, I mean, a focus of discussion today. Please do keep sharing those solutions in the Slido. We can share another link in the chat here to access that, and that will all be factored into some of our post-session and post-summit outputs that will really help our work going forward. So please do keep putting inputs there. However, I know we're, again, running short on time. Everyone's been pretty good on timelines, so really appreciated, but keen to hear from our panelists again. And for this round to dive a little more deeply into some of the specific issues facing consumers and some of the specific solutions that we might be able to resolve. I'm going to go back to Shelley to get us started. What do you see, Shelley, as the most significant barriers to the consumption of healthy diets by vulnerable or low-income consumers?
Thank you, Charlie. In many low and middle-income countries, 60 to 95% of food that is consumed by households are purchased. So the rest is either produced by households or received as gifts. So even in countries where a high percentage of the population is rural, we need to pay attention to food markets, not just on-farm production, is in terms of one of the determinants of consumption, and if we're going to have an impact on diets. I will quickly highlight 5 barriers to the consumption of healthy, sustainable diets. And we've heard about several of these in the previous round of discussion. So availability and accessibility is the first barrier. And for this issue, the Consumer International key principle that says that we need to make sustainable and healthy choices more available and accessible for all, rather than placing the onus of responsibility on consumers, really resonates. Food environments, or where consumers meet a food market, they're critical. We have to ensure that healthy, sustainable foods are available year-round in food markets. If consumer choice is constrained to relatively unhealthy options like we see in certain retail markets, it doesn't matter what aspiration or intention a consumer brings to that buying decision. Environmental and economic volatility, such as brought on by a pandemic, a drought, conflict, exacerbate the problem of availability and accessibility of healthy, sustainable foods. So this is really the first and foremost issue. What food is available and how accessible is it to consumers? Second, affordability. We've heard and we know from FAO and the SOFI report annually that just under 3 billion people globally cannot afford a healthy diet. And in some African countries, that percentage goes up to 3/4 of the population for whom a healthy diet is not available. The good news is that an increasing number of countries are actually tracking this problem using their own market price data to gain a more nuanced understanding of what foods are driving healthy diets to be out of reach for so much of their population. And the next frontier is supporting countries to understand the investment and policy decisions that they can take to improve the affordability of healthy, sustainable diets. So affordability has really come on the global and national agendas just in, in the last few years. Third, food safety. I've already spoken about this problem, so I'll just say that food is not healthy if it is contaminated with pathogens, and unsafe food should be thrown out, which just increases the environmental footprint of the food system. So food safety is a problem that definitely needs more attention. Fourth, knowledge of healthy and sustainable diets. Regardless of educational level, there is confusion over what constitutes a healthy and sustainable diet. The UN agencies, FAO, WHO, have jointly published normative guidance on healthy and sustainable diets, and many countries have national dietary guidelines that recommend diets based on locally available, culturally appropriate foods, and those should be our guiding posts. Finally, empowerment of consumers. Even if individual consumers have knowledge of and access to healthy, sustainable diets, they are sometimes not empowered within their households to make food purchasing decisions. So it is important for us to ensure that the consumer voices of the most vulnerable are heard. And a key principle of Consumers International which is a key principle of Consumers International, and we need to work to gain a more nuanced understanding of how consumers make decisions about the food they consume. And lastly, I will just say that any one of these barriers can be limiting, so it's not just sufficient to address one or two of them. They all need attention. And it's important for us to understand the multiple cultural, social, and economic factors driving consumers' food purchasing and consumption decisions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shelley. I think building on that pretty directly, thinking about some of these specific policies, Ricardo, could you share a little more about what are some of the key policies that the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty recommends to strengthen access to food for vulnerable consumers?
Thank you, Charlie. So the Global Alliance is committed to eradicate hunger and malnutrition. And we recognize that we have to increase the access to food for vulnerable consumers, of course. So we've developed a basket of proven policies gathered from all over the world that are backed by rigorous evaluation and that target SDG 1 and 2 to end poverty and hunger. And the beauty of the basket, the grace of it, is its adaptability. So as Juan told us, we have to consider the cultural context, socioeconomic context. So for example, in a country that has low agricultural productivity and lack of food supply, we have policies in the basket that are to increase rural credit, increase access to agricultural inputs, alongside crucial technical assistance to smallholder farmers, as some of our colleagues mentioned as well. But sometimes the country has enough food supply, but not enough nutritious food. So, for example, there is a policy from India that adds fish powder to school meals to increase the nutritious capabilities of the food. So we should consider this type of food. In countries that the poverty incidence is still very high, we must think about cash transfers. But cash transfers often is not enough to fight food insecurity, because many times the major driver of food insecurity is labor income volatility. For example, in Brazil during the pandemics, we had a big cash transfer, emergency aid, and it was not enough because most of the ones that are food insecure are informal urban workers or smallholder farmers that depend on daily sales, so that a monthly cash transfer is not enough for them to fight food insecurity. So to conclude that we only have 3 minutes, and thinking about all this, we should, I like to highlight policies that affect the whole food system. So some of the crucial policies in the basket are the public food procurement and the school meals. And this is good because it affects the supply, the distribution, and the demand. So at the same time that the government buys food from smallholder farmers that are local, increasing the stability of the market and decreasing the income instability, we provide nutritious food for vulnerable children in the schools. And at the same time, this is local.
30 seconds to wrap up, please.
This is local, so it shortens the supply chain and make more sustainable productivity. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I know, again, a lot of information to fit in, and would definitely recommend everyone go and look at those wider recommendations of the Global Alliance on that point. Geeta, when thinking about the challenges, some of which Ricardo mentioned, that governments face, what are the barriers that you see to implementing key policies for advancing to access to food from a government perspective in particular, and how might we address these? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlie. In terms of the key policies for advancing access to food, before I go into the key challenges, I'd like to mention 3 things. First, and some of it has already been spoken, but just to reinforce, one is addressing losses and waste. 1 billion meals a day are being lost, and close to 1 billion people are going hungry. So, and this is really a symptom of a broken food system. It's also one of the pillars now of the post-Malabo for Africa. So, so this is clearly one policy lever that we need to understand and address. Second is the affordability story. $2.65 a day is a cost, is a poverty, international poverty line. And the cost of a healthy diet is between $4 and $5. So there is a big disconnect in terms of affordability, in terms of what we're asking people to eat, they just cannot afford. And again, here I go back to the social protection programs to be more nutrition sensitive. The third is in terms of key policies for accessing and much more at a macros level, is we do know that highly food insecure countries are also highly they have high levels of debt. So I think we need to have some kind of an instrument, debt for development, debt for food on the table, to be able to really help these countries improve not just access to the basic human right, but also there's a liquidity crisis in these countries. And there's a very good argument why debt for food swaps should be on the table is on the permanency, because permanency argument, we know children and women are most affected by poor diets or lack of access of food. And there's a permanent human capital loss. So just keeping the permanency argument makes this a very viable instrument. What is the big challenge we are seeing is really the political economy challenge of these countries moving into policies that are good for their consumers, good for the population, good for the economy, good for the planet health. And the largest funding of food systems is domestic funding, and we know 800 billion of public support is really not creating a healthy planet or a healthy economy or healthy people. To be able to make that shift happen is the issue right now in the food systems. Doesn't matter which angle we take in terms of thinking, whether it's on the diet side, access side, affordability side. Back to you.
Thanks, Geeta. Again, so much insight there into a very short intervention, so really helpful and really valuable for moving forward on. I'd like to think from our last couple of speakers about what is the role that consumer advocacy and consumer organizations can play in advancing some of these approaches. Going first to Alice, how do you see consumer advocacy can help to drive policy change, in particular from your experience in Kenya, to support access to good food? What are the tools available? Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlie, for that opportunity again. Earlier, I had a challenge over a network, but now I'm okay. How can consumer advocates come in handy? One, advocates will come in handy in raising awareness, educating the public and policymakers about food security, nutrition, and sustainable food systems. Systems that are pro-environment and systems that are going to ensure that the foods in the markets are culturally acceptable. We encourage out of the advocacy that there will be individual responsibility of a consumer and collaborations among the actors along the value chain. And so out of raising awareness, the public and also the policymakers will be aware of the food systems that are pro-environment and the food systems that are culturally acceptable. And we look forward to influencing legislation. And I want to give an example here of what we have done as Consumer Grassroots Association. Through the grassroots advocacy, consumers themselves were able to petition the county governments. And as we speak today, we were able to push through and encourage the consumers to push through and go to the county governments. And right now, through the advocacy bid that we did, we have 5 legislations that are agroecologically aligned at the county government of Kajiado. And this did not just come in an overnight. It went about 3-4 years to ensure that we come up to that. So meaning that this is a proven thing that we, through advocacy, consumers themselves, once they're empowered, they can go ahead and demand for the food systems that they want as a people. So we'll be lobbying for policies and promote fair food prices, food subsidies, and sustainable farming and consumer protection. As advocates also, we are looking forward for promoting the food justice in this manner, that would want food that is produced within a particular area. If it's in surplus, it needs to be distributed to other parts where this food is needed. So fair distribution of food is what we will be encouraging, and we are still encouraging as consumer advocates. We would like to encourage the local and sustainable food systems that are locally acceptable, and farmers are able to engage in those systems easily, not just importing some other new methods, new technologies that are not working locally. You know, many times when, and especially when we get support, or when people get support, or institutions get support, they're usually told what to do, what to produce, and because the back donor maybe may want to see what they want to see in the ground. That's not actually attaining food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is when we allow consumers to decide what is supposed to be in the table for them. And we want to challenge unfair trade practices. And in Africa, we are privileged to have the FCFTA. Yes, locally, we are trying to work closely with trade ministries and competition authorities to ensure that there are fair food prices. You know, fair market and fair market practices are the ones that are pushing even the nutritious food prices to go higher. So, I mean, pushing
30 seconds,
consumers
please.
to go for maybe the last one, just the last one. Would really want to foster a multi-sectoral engagement platform where all actors can come and share under one platform. And that way, we'll together come with solutions that are going to help us achieve sustainable lifestyles. Thank you, Shirley.
Thanks, Alice. And yeah, amazing to hear about how it's being put into practice by yourself in Kenya and by our members all around the world. We're going to finish at 5 minutes to the hour, so wrapping up pretty quick here. But Juan, just enough time to hear your final thoughts to finish us up. What action, building on what we just heard, what action is needed from governments and from consumers to ensure that, like Alice says, that consumer voice is heard in this policy process? Over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Charlie, and I think it builds on what some of the other panelists have already said, right? I could summarize that in terms of the role of consumers by saying that consumers do not just eat food, they shape food systems. But for their voices to matter, both governments and consumers, they need to step up, right? So governments need to create real spaces for consumer participation, as Rose was mentioning with several examples. And this is not just consultations, but actual sit at the table. That means, in my view, for instance, including consumer representatives in food policy councils, wherever those exist, or in price setting discussions, or even in trade negotiations, right? And I think it was Stefanos that mentioned, and also others earlier, that consumers, they have the power because their individual choices matter, but collective action matters more. So when consumers organize through advocacy groups, like the members of Consumers International, of course, or via food cooperatives or policy campaigns, they can really push for stronger protections, for healthier food environments, for more sustainable production. Consumer organizations, right, really have huge strength of outreach. And I think, again, Rose shares some great examples on that. But let's also, again, remember that we cannot put the burden only on the consumers or mainly on the consumers. Governments have a legal mandate, as per international law, as I mentioned before, to ensure that large corporations, for instance, which often control the food systems, and let's be honest about it, it happens at all stages. The supply of the seeds and fertilizers that farmers require, the logistics of food, the food processing, the retailing. And so these corporations should really respect the right to food. And protecting the right to food means that government should disincentivize ultra-processed and healthy foods, and should enforce clear labeling, and should promote fair pricing, and should promote also safety regulations, and basically, avoid market abuse as well. And Charlie, we are very proud that at FAO we work to connect all these dots, bringing the policymakers and the consumers into these dialogues, ensuring that food systems aren't just designed for people, but with people. Because at the end, it's the voice of consumers that has to be heard. Because if it's not heard, food systems simply will not work, neither for us, the people, or for the planet.
Thank you, Juan. Yeah, a really effective point to finish on. And I think captures a lot of what we've heard from all of our panelists throughout the session. The importance of interconnected action, but also seeing that this is starting to take place really as an essential need. Importance of building consumer voice into that to recognize what are the challenges they face, what are the barriers, often not always the same barriers that we would expect, but also the opportunities that emerge by coming at this from a consumer lens of demanding change to government, to business in a way that is often more difficult for many other actors. We do need to wrap up this call at this time, I'm afraid, so no time to dive back into. I'd love to hear a little bit more from all of our speakers, but I'd just like to share a thanks to everyone for a really valuable discussion, to all of our attendees for joining, of course, a really important role, and really appreciate all of the comments that we have in the chat and in the Slido. I'll be sharing our overview of the session with all of our participants some point later in the week, and of course we'll have some materials coming out of the summit as well. I'm just sharing in the chat in case you're interested to join our next session of the summit, focused on consumer information for trust, safety and sustainability, starting in just a couple of minutes' time. Please do sign up for that session if you'd be interested. We have more throughout the week, including another session on food tomorrow on the shift to sustainable diets. But otherwise, I think I'm going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks everyone so much for a really valuable discussion, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in Addis Ababa, at COP30, beyond, all throughout the year, as well as, of course, in all of these countries around the world where consumer groups are driving the change in practice. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.